Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. Today I want to talk about COVID. I want to talk specifically about the schools and a story in the daily newspaper here in Charlottesville entitled Board Grapples with How to Reopen Schools. You see, they're talking about reopening the schools, but they have found themselves between a rock and a hard place. Who are they? Well, they're the school administrators, the teachers who hate Trump, who love that COVID is ravaging America, and yet are highly conflicted. So what happens in the city of Charlottesville or in Albemarle County when they're stuck between a rock and a hard place? This story by Catherine Knott. Board grapples with how to reopen schools, faced with rising numbers of coronavirus cases in the area and elsewhere, and a slew of other concerns. The Charlottesville School Board is torn about how to reopen to students this fall. And yes, they're torn and they're contorting because they don't know what to do. And these people are so feckless and weak. I think of the chair of the school board stumbling all over herself, wanting to appear to be a hero, wanting to please everybody, and realizing that this is an issue that's going to make about 50% of your people mad at you. This is not a win-win situation. And so, yes, they're acting as if they're very deliberative. I think they've already made up their minds. The story continues. How to reopen schools should be a community decision, Superintendent Atkins said during the board meeting. They focused on plans for what's coming up in this academic school year. But what was so interesting and what set all of this off and what sent the school board and the superintendent into a wild panic, because a group of about 150 teachers, staff members signed an open letter asking the school board and the superintendent to opt for what they're calling a virtual start to the school year, among other requests. This is fascinating because now you have the teachers and they're enjoying, I'm hearing the story, how much they're enjoying getting paid full salary for doing very little, if any, work. And now, in favor of their own interest, because they have a conflict of interest, they're saying, hey, we don't want to go back to work. Well, we're saying it's for the safety of our fellow teachers and even for the students. What they like is the reduced workload, and they're receiving a massive reduction in workload. I've heard there are some teachers in the fine arts departments around here that are working maybe 3 to 4 hours a week and getting a full salary, and even some moving out of the area while keeping their jobs in this age of COVID. Last week, according to the story, the Charlottesville division shared a new attendance plan for the coming year, and here's the plan. They would have students in school 4 days a week. That would be elementary school students with at-home learning on Fridays. Oh, I'll bet you, when I was in second grade, we had something called Friday is Fun Day, and I'll bet you Friday would be Fun Day here. Students in the 7th grade and up would go to school only 2 days a week in Charlottesville. At-home learning on the remaining days. Yeah, you know they're not going to be doing that, or not much of it, unless the parents are extraordinarily diligent, as the students are as well. Because I've heard reports from a lot of people that, well, no one's doing this at-home learning, at least over the past few months. They just blew it off. And of course, the parents can also choose what they're calling an all-online option, which I've been encouraging parents to do that exclusively, because all online gets your kids out of the poisonous atmosphere and these teachers that hate America that are indoctrinating these students to do the same thing, oftentimes against the wishes of their parents. Now we go to the mask. The mask will be required for students and staff, except for those who can't wear them because of medical conditions. Now, that could be a pretty broad exception. If you think about abortion, they say, well, for the health of the mother, that could cover anything. I wonder if they'll give the same latitude to people who are allergic to tyranny, as a friend of mine says. and don't want to wear the mask. Probably aren't too many of those in the government schools, but there may be a few. Students and staff will be asked to provide their own masks, although the division will have them available, as well as face shields. So I wonder if it's going to be like the beginning of the year and they ask everybody to bring a dozen masks and they just put them in a big pot. No one gets to put their name on them because, we don't have any private property ownership in the government schools. Everything is shared. Even with all the measures we're putting in place, we will not create a risk-free environment, said Superintendent Rosa Atkins. She reminds me of a frequent critic of the Schilling Show, Ken the Democrat, who's looking for somehow everybody to be wrapped in cotton and bubble wrap and put in a sterilized place and to never have any risks in life. Kids are at risk by going to the government schools just because of the garbage and the crap you're cramming down their throats, with all due respect. The division planning to push back the first day of school to September 8th. Of course, that's the same thing that the Albemarle schools did. They can't think for themselves, obviously, but the later, the better, in my opinion. The later, the better. The chair of the school board, often verbally challenged, Jennifer McKeever, said she appreciated everyone's ideas. See, here's where we're going to start going, like trying to make everybody happy, that Jennifer McKeever is a real pleaser. She's a nice enough person. Nothing personal against Jennifer McKeever, but my goodness, you talk about indecisive. I cannot imagine trying to come up with something in this unprecedented environment that will serve the needs of 4,500 children, which is what we're trying to do. A long and convoluted way of saying, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. And by the way, what were you doing before this? How were you serving the needs of 4,500 children before this time, as if this was a monolithic group? You see how ridiculous these comments are. She said, but we cannot continue to do it alone, and we cannot continue to be asked to bear the burden of this. Hey, you're elected, lady. You're the chair of the school board. You're the one who wanted the responsibility. And now when the water gets hot, you want out. You want to jump out of the pot and throw it into somebody else's lap. Hey, the buck stops here. You remember Harry Truman, Jennifer McKeever? Board member Leah Puryear, who I also have a nice relationship with, said this will be the most difficult decision she's ever made in her tenure on the board. Well, you've been there so long, all of you have, because you just go in there and occupy the space instead of opening it up for other people. Now you have a long tenure and you have something to remember your time by. There's no right decision, she said, adding that she sees it as a life and death situation. Now, I thought that was a very interesting comment. A life and death situation meaning what? Well, does it mean that people are going to die either way, no matter what you do? Because that's what it sounds like to me. If there's no right decision and it's life or death, it means that you are condemning some people to life and some people to death, no matter what you do. At least that's the way I read it. Puryear said she didn't know how she would sleep at night if anyone in the buildings became infected with the virus or died. You know what? You have to take your responsibility with the understanding that bad things happen. There could have been a school shooting. There were certainly threats in Charlottesville schools, although they were trumped up and phony race issues that really weren't. But you have to realize that in life, you're going to lose some people. Not that you want to, not that you're deciding to, and not that you're not doing everything you can to make sure it doesn't happen. But making a statement like that shows me that you're really out of touch. No one wants somebody to die. You never did before this either, and it certainly could have happened. Hey, a chalkboard could have fallen over on somebody's head and hurt them or killed them. Emily Little, a parent of a Burnley Moran student, listen to this quote. We have to think of where these children are going beyond the school community and beyond the walls of the school, and whether they're safer at school from coronavirus than they are in the places and spaces they may have to go. What is she talking about? Is she talking about abusive households? Is she aware that children are being abused and she hasn't called Child Protective Services? You mean the school is better than parents or family, according to Emily Little? Oh, the places these students will go, but they'll be safe at school where their minds will be poisoned, but they'll be bodily safe. Well, maybe. Little added that the 2-day option made her nervous because students might have to interact with more people as their parents piece together childcare for the other 3 days. Isn't this outrageous? Oh, we don't want our children interacting with people except for the teachers that are poisoning their minds and the other students that are bullying them in the government schools. And their minds are being filled with all sorts of garbage that's against God and in favor of things that the parents and their faith may be teaching them is wrong, but that's a safe space for students. Remarkable, isn't it? These parents themselves are so lost. Other concerns coming from parents about the next school year. Distance learning during the spring didn't go well, and they're worried about the quality of education if school continues online. How fascinating. What's the quality of education if your kids go back there? Are they doing well on the tests? Are they coming out smart? Can they read, write? Do they know American history? Oh, not the indoctrinated portion of it, but do they know real and true American history? You see how foolish this is? If you really wanted online or distance learning to go well, you would put the time in yourself. But unfortunately for all of us, this is basically a daycare for parents who don't want to take responsibility. I'm not saying that every person is in a position to homeschool, but you ought to be a strong advocate for school choice, and you could put your kids in a place like Regents or Community Christian Academy or a number of other places that are so far superior to the local government schools it would make your head spin, and yet they don't want it. They want indoctrination, and they also want complete safety. They don't want their kids interacting with anybody outside of the government schools, which in and of itself is a toxic environment. Now, a little bit of sanity here. Christine Esposito, she's probably going to get blasted for this, even though she happens to perhaps be, by her last name, maybe a woman of color. I don't know her. She's a gifted resource teacher at Johnson Elementary, which is also interesting because that would put her on the S list for a lot of people who don't like gifted resources being put towards students who are quote unquote gifted. She said she didn't sign this letter that 150 of her peers signed because she's not convinced that a virtual start is necessary. The story here in the daily newspaper tells us that a lengthy Facebook post, she addressed various concerns from the supply of disinfectant wipes and hand sanitizer to the lack of robust, widespread COVID-19 testing. She also said she's concerned about classrooms without windows and how the division can adjust to the new reality without more funding. And there we go. We want more money. So she's kind of right on track in one area, that she's disagreeing with the COVID Karens who are teaching and staff in the government schools in Charlottesville. But on the other hand, they're just looking for more money. More money to do less. That's what they want. Now, here is something that was sent to me, and it's about the horns of the dilemma that the Democrats are riding right now. No good options. And I think this is absolutely fascinating. On the one hand, they want to keep the panic porn going, with fear of the Wuhan virus driving the narrative. Oh, we must be afraid. We must be scared. Because this is panic porn. We're addicted to it. It makes us feel good, but we know it's rotten at the core. So everybody needs to stay home. All the businesses need to stay shut down. And I'll tell you what, if you're running a business and I see somebody there without a mask, I'm going to the governor's snitch line to report you. And I'm also going to put you on social media, and I'm going to say all sorts of bad things about you and encourage people to go after you. Yes, all the schools must be closed down because, well, that's part of the panic porn. Of course, the world is coming to an end under Trump. That is, unless Joe Biden is elected. And miraculously, the world will open up again the day after. Let's call it the Wednesday in November, after the first Tuesday in November. Everything goes entirely open and everybody would be just fine because the Democrats are in charge. Maybe that wouldn't happen till the third week of 2021 in January. However, the conflict on the other side, they're being crushed by conflicting demands of constituent groups they've bought off for decades. The teachers and administrative jobs, the high-paid administrators, because, well, we need all of those with the schools closed, right? Those might end up being cut due to not needing as many people for virtual school. You see, when they find out the emperor has no clothes, we really don't need all those teachers and administrators. What are we going to do? Do we have to fire somebody? Maybe we could find a place for them in central office, all of them. The 50% we don't need anymore or more. Because why do you have a limit on class size when you're teaching virtually? Inquiring minds want to know. And here we go. Tax revenues lower in most localities because bad economic situations. There just might not be enough money, and all of the little things that you want to give to the kids in the schools and the government schools, you're not going to have any money to fund them. That is, unless you shut the police down, and maybe you could steal that money and distribute it at the government schools. But yeah, we're going to have a lot of problems. And of course, all the freebies that they're giving out, food, free medical care, speech therapy, babysitting, which is the key one, those may start drying up because the schools are closed. So what are you going to do? Are you going to home deliver food for people? I think they've already been doing that. The drying up process will go on because people will become weary of being food distribution centers when there's no students there to indoctrinate. So the Democratic Party is in a predicament because they're demanding continuation of school indoctrination mills. That's a source of votes presently and in the future. Very good point. You know what the schools are for. They're to give good little Democrats the idea that that's all they can vote for in the future. The Republicans are evil. The Democrats are good. Socialism is good. Capitalism is evil. A point settled. So here's a dichotomy. We want the schools open, and yet the teachers are calling for them to be closed out of fear and also out of personal greed. The longer kids and parents are out of the indoctrination camps, the more likely they may never go back. And I've talked to a lot of people who are looking at options right now. Hey, even if you're starting out and saying, hey, I want to go to the Virginia Virtual Academy, which is basically the school's curriculum, but in your own home, on your own computer, at your own time, without the indoctrinating influences of the government schools, at least the in-person ones, that's where you start. And then you go from there. It's a wonderful thing to have your kids at home. And if you can't do it, and I realize not everybody can, you have private school options, but it needs to be a priority for you. But what they're frightened of is the long period of time between when kids remember going to school and parents remember sending the convenience of sending their kids out to what is in essence indoctrinatory daycare. And those memories start to fade. They're like, hey, I love having my kids at home. They've changed. They've become so much better to be around. Yeah, that's what happens in most instances. So the plus side of all of this is the further away we get from the daily routine of thinking that you send your kids to these horrible indoctrination camps, that will be fewer brainwashed voters and citizens in the future, which is a very, very, very good thing. I cannot overestimate it. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues.
Associated Press award-winning journalist Rob Schilling.
BorderHawk.News is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.News highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.News will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.News. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Looking out for us. Rob Schilling.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with University of Virginia professor Edwin T. Burton. And the topic today is a very important one. We're going to be talking about a sea of COVID lies and where is the COVID truth. Professor Burton, welcome to the Schilling Show, and thank you so much for joining us. I want to start out by talking about the spike we've been hearing about in all the COVID cases. The spike, would you address that?
60,000 cases per day. And if you think that's a big number, remember the CDC projected that there would be 200,000 cases per day by June 1st. And we're well into July, and we have a third of the numbers that the CDC projected. That projection was made on May 1st. So the projections are simply astronomical, but the reality is we're up from numbers at that time were around the high 30s, roughly around 40,000 cases per day, and we're up to 60. But the vast bulk of that is asymptomatic positive results and younger people. The death numbers have come down dramatically, and depending on the day, they run about between 10% and 30% of what they were just 2 months ago. So the death numbers have really dropped dramatically, and the hospitalization numbers countrywide have also dropped fairly substantially. So the situation of the virus is actually pretty good. You can pick and choose spots. You can find cases going up one day somewhere or deaths going up one day, but if you smooth the numbers, for example, if you actually smooth the numbers in states like Florida and Texas, you don't really find a lot going on. So especially Florida. Florida looks really good, even the latest data. Texas has had some big numbers recently, but if you smooth the data at all, they've had a lot of small numbers recently too. So one day you might have 10 deaths, and the next day you might have 40. And you smooth those, you got 50 over 2 days. It's not like they're rising exponentially. The media takes 2 days, and if the number of deaths is 1 on Thursday and 2 on Friday, they say there's a 100% increase. And then when Saturday comes and it goes back to 1, there's no comment. So there's a lot of cherry picking in the news media. I mean, you can always find, these are kind of random numbers. People don't die in some systematic fashion. And the difference between dying at 11:59 at night and 12:01 in the morning seems to make a lot of difference to people in the media, but it doesn't make any difference to anybody in the real world. So, but if you look broadly at the numbers, and the virus now is, you're looking at numbers that sort of vary between 250 and 800 a day in terms of the number of deaths. You average that number, that's like 500 a day. That would be 1,500 a month. That's well below, substantially below the numbers that are killed by the flu virus per month, and even runs below the number of people that die in traffic accidents every month. Numbers we're looking at are not that large.
Ed, I'd like to ask you about testing and the impact of increased testing, because obviously if we test more people, we're going to find more of the virus. And is that being factored into the calculation and the percentages?
No, there's not much comment about that, but you can see it in the hospitalizations. If you look at the Texas data, for example, where the hospitalizations have gone up, predominantly in the under 40 age group. That's where the big so-called surge in hospitalization cases. And while those are, serious hospitalization cases, very few of those people will die. Very few people die under the age of 60 from this disease. So you may have people in the hospital, struggling for a little while. We have that for every disease in America. It's not unusual. People go to the hospital and they frequently don't die. And in this case, the number of deaths in that age category are statistically really less than the number of deaths you get from the flu on an annual basis. So if you look at the numbers, we're now beginning to test more people that don't have any symptoms. You see outbreaks among young people. For example, young people go to the bars and ends up, 30 new cases. But the question is, what happens with those cases? How many of those cases are just purely asymptomatic? How many actually go to hospital? And if you look at the total death numbers in the country, or the total death numbers in Florida or state or Texas or Arizona or anywhere in the country, or to be honest, anywhere in the world, the death numbers are still coming down. They're coming down pretty dramatically compared to where they were 2 months ago. Just anywhere you look in the globe, whether it's Brazil or Sweden or Europe or Italy or the U.S. or New York City or even Texas or Florida or Arizona, all these numbers are down. No matter what people are telling you in the media, all these numbers are down. And so you'll continue to have cases. I wouldn't be surprised if you end up with 100,000 cases per day. But if these are mostly cases without any symptoms, it really has no serious significance.
Let me go to the deaths that you reference and the numbers here, because I have heard reports directly and indirectly about misattribution of deaths to COVID because there's a financial incentive from hospitals. Do you have any information on that or any opinion on what you're hearing about misattribution?
Well, I'm not there in the hospital room, or I haven't really observed any of this. The stories you get when you talk to doctors about it, let's say a patient comes into the hospital with some kind of a problem, but it's not a COVID-19 problem. And then the patient is tested for COVID-19. And let's suppose they die of the problem that they came in with. Then it's attributed as a COVID-19 death. Just to give you the kind of stark example, if somebody plunges head first from a six-story window and hits the ground and is killed, but then they test him for COVID-19 and he's got COVID-19, then he's attributed as a COVID-19 death. Now, I don't know of any examples like that, but it's the philosophy of it. If someone happens to have COVID-19 and he dies, then the automatic assumption is that's what he died of. Well, people can test positive for a number of things. That doesn't mean that's what they die of. They die of whatever kills them, but it's turning out in a lot of the data. Here's another thing about data.
Yes.
I was talking to a friend of mine in Charlottesville whose son is a doctor in North Carolina. And he said in hospitals in that area, they'll test somebody positive, and that same person will come in 4 or 5 days later and be retested to see where they stand, and they'll test them positive. And then they count both of those as positive cases.
Wow.
So the same person tests positive a few times, they end up, that's just anecdotal. I'm not saying that happens nationwide or anything else, but there seems to be a concerted effort by a lot of the media to make this problem seem really, really serious. So they use, and it is serious, but it's not as serious as they're claiming. They use the word spike and surge and catastrophe. But if you would take the time to look at the data, and if anyone's listening to this and wants to look at the data, Worldometers keeps track of the data. You can just go www.worldometers, all one word, worldometers.com. And there you can just pick any country, any state you want, and you can actually look at the data, and you can see the death charts and the cases charts and even the hospitalization information. Another website that does all this is Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins Medical School does this. And I encourage anyone who's concerned about all of this, instead of reading what shows up in inflammatory style in the media, look at the actual data. Take a look at the actual data and see how many cases there are per day, how many deaths per day, hospitalization. Just look at all that data is available. And it's available for any country you'd be interested in. You notice the media has lost interest in Sweden and Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
You know why they've lost interest in Sweden and Brazil?
Tell us.
Guess why? The news on the virus is excellent. The numbers are falling. The cases in Sweden have dropped dramatically. The deaths have fallen off the cliff. Things look really good in Sweden. Yes, Sweden has a large number of deaths. There are a lot of countries that do, a lot of states that do in the U.S. But the problem is essentially, over in Sweden. And if you look at the actual data, they've been through it. They didn't do any shutdowns or closings. And that's an embarrassing piece of data for those that want to argue for school closings and shutdowns. I mean, there are plenty of countries that aren't doing a lot of this. Once again, there's a big story on Hong Kong today.
Yeah.
Hong Kong. They have 5 deaths. and yes, there are more cases. But some of these countries, like Vietnam, I remember reading a story about Vietnam and how the cases were exploding in Vietnam. Vietnam is still waiting to have their first death. No one has died in Vietnam. Scary stories about Vietnam. And I just encourage people who read these stories in the Washington Post or even in the Daily Progress, the Richmond Times, or any of the media, or see it on television, go look at the data. The data is very different from what the media is actually telling you about the data. And it's the data that should guide decisions, not inflammatory projections and stories like, 2 million people are going to die and all this kind of stuff. I mean, 2 million people are very unlikely to die from this globally. We're not even close to those numbers even now. With 500,000 global deaths from this. And yet people talk about millions and millions and millions and millions. So it's all about what's going to happen in the future and exponential growth. But in no state or country has the virus ever grown exponentially. Not one. There's not a single example anywhere in the data of cases growing exponentially anywhere in the world. And I defy anyone to show me one. Not in any state or country in the world. They've never grown exponentially. And you can just look at Worldometer. Worldometer has these nice logarithmic curves. So they show the actual pattern of cases, and all these logarithmic curves all curve down. That means in order for exponential growth to occur, it has to curve up, and there's not a single one that curves up, logarithmic scale. Not one. All you read about is exponential growth, all your spikes, surges. There just aren't any. So I just encourage people to actually look at the actual data.
Ed, we're talking with Professor Ed Burton at the University of Virginia, professor of economics there. Let's talk about the increase in the asymptomatic positive results that you referenced earlier. And you say this is good news. I want you to make it clear to our listening audience why it's good and how this ties into herd immunity that we've heard so much about.
Well, let me give you a simple example. Suppose you have a group of kindergartners. And the question is, do we let them go back to school? If they go back to school, as long as they are not in contact with elderly, they can, contract the virus. So it's very hard to do, by the way. It's very hard for the virus to be passed among children. Mm-hmm. And that's been clear since Johns Hopkins made that statement about 2 months ago. But let's suppose everyone in the kindergarten that could possibly catch it catches it. Within a few weeks, they'll ultimately develop herd immunity, and then everybody that deals with them is safe. But if you go the other route and you say we can't have kindergarten, so the child is placed back in the home, if the parents work, then you get the grandparents involved. That's happened in my case. When Albemarle decided to eliminate its schools back in March, the 2 grandchildren, aged 6 and 9, showed up on my doorstep. Mm-hmm. And I've had them, and I'll be 78 years old pretty soon, so I'm kind of more in the category of people threatened by this, certainly than they are. And so school closed, to some extent, the only way the virus ever goes away is herd immunity. So if your plan is to block herd immunity, then the virus never goes away. Then we never have public schools. Then we never have a real economy. And maybe there are people that are in favor of that, but I don't think most people are. I think most people would like to see the children educated. There's really no risk to the child. No serious risk. The only real risk is to elderly Americans with comorbidity conditions. And what we should have done, and we never did, was protect the elderly. We never protected the nursing homes. We're now beginning to look into that, but that should have been done early on. And in some places that had large number of deaths, like New York State, they actually mandated putting coronavirus cases into nursing homes. That seemed like the devil's strategy. I mean, it's just unbelievable that you would do something like that. But even in Virginia, nursing homes were not protected adequately. The vast bulk of the deaths in Virginia are coming in nursing homes. It's not coming in kindergarten, and it's not coming from college students drinking in bars, and it isn't. Yes, college students may get the virus drinking in bars, but what's the adverse health effect? No one ever follows that story up. 23 Clemson football players contracted the virus, but did any of them go to the hospital? What is their situation now? Are they out running track? Just because somebody tests positive and doesn't show any symptoms, is that a healthcare crisis? It's more important what the hospitalization numbers look like, what the death numbers look like. Those are the important considerations. Most experts think that somewhere around 85% of all people who will test positive will end up asymptomatic. 85%. And then even among the other 15%, the majority will have fairly mild symptoms. The death numbers are, for the entire country, we have 130,000 deaths. And how many people would you guess have the virus? Well, a lot of people think, well, let's say 3% of our population. That's 10 million people. Mm-hmm. So if 10 million people have the virus and 130,000 have died, what kind of numbers are those? That's a very tiny death rate. It's not clear why there's so much attention to cases that are asymptomatic. If you look at the age category under 20 years old in America from the beginning of this entire coronavirus, how many people have died in that age category under 20 years of age? Well, the number's 160. I wish it was 0.
Yeah.
But 160 out of that population, that is and who knows that they really died of the coronavirus? Typically, when anyone dies of the coronavirus that's young, they have a multiplicity of other health problems. It's often not clear. Even among the ages, if someone comes in with a heart attack and ends up dying of COVID-19, how do you know they died of COVID-19? How do you know they might have lasted another hour and died of a heart attack? We just don't know all these things. What you do know is the total hospitalizations and deaths per day. You can see the patterns. Those patterns are very, very favorable in the U.S., and they're incredibly favorable in Virginia. Look at Virginia. Virginia had a peak number of cases of 1,300 back in mid-May. And what happened? Front page headline in the Richmond Times and in the Daily Progress at the time was that, quote, UVA experts forecast the number of cases to go to 5,000. Well, they actually read into the article, it said 5 to 10,000. Well, the number at the time was 1,300. So where do you think we are now? 2,000, 3,000, 4,000? Try 600.
Wow.
We have half the number of cases. And what was the projection? 5 to 10,000.
Mm-hmm.
So we're running at 10% of the projections, 10% or less of the projections. And yet, those estimates were the basis of Governor Northam's policies. They were based on estimates that turned out to be 10 times the actual number and in the wrong direction. Cases not only didn't go up by 500%, they actually dropped by 50%. So the policy is based on predictions that are wildly inaccurate and unrelated to the facts. Change the mandates. The mandates just come on regardless of what the facts show.
So, Ed Burton, this is very interesting. So what are we to make of the experts? If these are experts at the University of Virginia, or we have national experts who didn't even know whether or not masks worked in stopping a virus as of a few months ago, how do we put any credence into any of these experts?
Well, not only on the subject of masks, that's interesting because I remember watching Dr. Birx tell us all that we shouldn't actually wear masks.
Right.
That was the official policy, and the CDC said the same thing. And there wasn't some new scientific study that came out that said masks are effective. Mm-hmm. They just changed their mind. It was very similar. Did you notice in Virginia when the University of Virginia Hospital announced that they were losing $90 million a month?
Yes.
Within 24 hours, the governor suspended the ban on elective surgeries. Is that based on a science or a health consideration? Or was that just based on the consideration you didn't want to see the UVA hospital go under? That's a financial consideration, not a health consideration. But everything is supposed to be driven by science and health. That decision couldn't possibly have been driven by science or health. So the whole mask situation, now they're talking about going from 6-foot distancing to 3-foot distancing. Mm-hmm. 3 foot is what they do in Europe. Why are they thinking of that? What science has come forward to suggest that's a good idea? And if you ask where the science is behind any of this, there is no science behind any of this. It's just a series of restrictions and mandates that will, as far as we can tell, never go away. There's no data that will ever make it go away. In Virginia, deaths have dropped, cases have dropped precipitously over the last 6 weeks. The numbers are falling every day, but that's not sufficient. We need more mandates, not less. The statewide mandate for masks was put on after cases and deaths had dropped over 30%. So here we are, a great record, declining deaths and cases, and what happens? Each week there are more and more restrictions, more and more mandates, and no reopening of the public schools 5 days a week. That's not on the table, according to the governor. And will it ever be on the table? Will 10 years from now we have 5-day public schools? And what will that depend on? And parents are asking those questions, and they're not getting any answers.
They certainly are not. We're talking with Professor Ed Burton, professor of economics at the University of Virginia, COVID-19 Truth in a World of COVID Lies. So I want to go to some of these draconian edicts, and you mentioned the school closings. We're also seeing a lot of trouble happening at businesses who are attempting to comply with the governor's orders, and yet if somebody comes into a business without a mask and has an underlying health issue, they're allowed not to have a mask on, and yet the social media bullies are trying to shut these businesses down. The governor set up a snitch line for churches and other businesses to get them in trouble. So where does that lead us as a society?
Well, I don't know. It does seem like there's a very strong tendency of a lot of people to want to kind of police other people.
Yes.
And there's recently my daughter who lives in Hawaii told me that there was a beachgoer. You're prohibited from going to the beach beaches, and somebody went out and walked their dog on a beach in Hawaii, and they got arrested and fined $1,000 for going out and walking. There wasn't anybody else around. I'm not exactly sure who this guy could have either given the coronavirus or contracted it from, because he was all by himself. But that's very typical of what's going on. And when you see people really fiercely defending mask policies, they're typically people that aren't really much at risk in terms of their demographic from either getting the virus or dying from the virus. You see an awful lot of 40-year-old people. And if you look at the data on 40-year-old people, the death rate there is definitely smaller than the average death rate for the flu virus, ordinary flu. And yet those people are demanding that other people wear masks because they're wearing masks and blah, 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 blah. The mask thing has almost become kind of a political statement more than a health statement or like that. No one has suggested that a mask protects you if somebody else has the virus. No one has suggested that. There's no health study on that. The only fig leaf for masks is the argument that if you have the virus and you have symptoms, then wearing a mask will serve, at least in part, to keep you from spreading it. But if you don't have any symptoms or you don't have the virus, wearing a mask is almost irrelevant, just an inconvenience. Even if you believe all the people that are pro-mask, the only argument is that if you have the virus and you have symptoms, then their argument reduces to you should have a mask. But that's very few people. That's what is it? 1.5% of the population at most, even if you tested everybody. It's not even that big a number. So all the mask wearing, for practical matter, it's a political statement more than anything else, I would say.
Professor Edwin T. Burton at the University of Virginia, thank you so much for sharing this time with the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Truly appreciate it, Ed. That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.